Hello, welcome to Librarian/Professor Wearing Two Hats at Once, a 2021 Glitter pre-conference session. I'm Jennie Law, a Reference and Instruction Librarian and Assistant Professor at Georgia State University Perimeter College Library. And I'll be speaking with you today about my experience during the semester of fall 2020 when I did my regular librarian duties, albeit mostly virtually, and I was also a professor for a semester-long course. That was entirely virtually. Before we get started, I want to go over some of the ways that I saw librarians and professors differing before I had my experience last semester. As time went on, I started to see a lot more overlap in the roles, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But before I started, I would often think of librarians as content generalists. So I pride myself on knowing a little bit about a lot of different things. I try to keep up with pop culture, I try to keep up with current events, and have a little bit of information about all the major disciplines that are studied on our campus. So even if it's not my favorite thing, even if it's not something I'm really good at or something I enjoy, and a video game I don't consume in my regular life, at least have a starting point so whoever comes to the reference desk, I can effectively answer their question or point them in the right direction. Likewise, I think of librarians as being information centrals or super nodes. No matter what's going on campus, we'll often be asked about events, programs, registration, financial aid, as well as the library's programs and resources. So we're often moving from subject to subject really fast. Some of it's practical information, some of it is subject or assignment based. And I think of librarians as being on our toes all the time and being really quick and ready to answer anything. I think of a librarian as providing academic clarity. So I often think about when I'm teaching in the library is kind of pulling the curtain back to see the man or the woman or the person back behind the curtain. If we're talking about Wizard of Oz, which I guess we weren't, but now we are. So I'll think of myself as pulling the curtain back so that the students can see how academics work and what the expectations are in academics. So not just explaining to them where to find citation information, but explaining to them the different types of citations and why citations are important to an academic conversation. How papers and projects can speak to each other and create a conversation using the citations as kind of a pathway through these papers. I often think it's really important that students understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. And I feel like librarians can provide that. Librarians provide database instruction. Usually that's 1 or 2 shot classes that go very deep into a particular database and the benefits that it will have for a student. And I've had experience with these doing reference one-on-ones or in the classes, as I was just mentioning. And then quick reference. This goes back to our last slide. Being really ready to answer anything at any time and point the student or the patron in the correct direction. I think of a professor as being a practice teacher, often engaging in the study of pedagogy on top of practicing their own pedagogy, being a subject expert. So they've devoted their professional life to a particular subject or discipline, and they've learned how to teach for that subject or discipline. I think of professors as providing academic foundation. So whereas we may pull back the curtain and we may show the mechanics laid bare, I think of the professor as providing the foundation. So they are teaching students how to follow a syllabus or what a syllabus is. They're teaching students how to think critically. They're doing a lot of different things to make sure that a student stays on track and understands how a class functions. Likewise, I think of them as creating the learning environment. They decide what's in their syllabus. They decide what the meetings are like, where they meet to some degree. And then, of course, providing specialized information and perspective. Whereas I think of myself as a content generalist, a professor provides a very deep look at possible minutia of a particular subject. Of course, they may be tasked with teaching one-on-one classes, and might be more of a survey of a discipline, but they've spent a lot of time and a lot of energy on being experts on their particular subject. So that's what I thought of each role before I had my own experience doing both. In January 2020, before COVID hit, the Honors College of Georgia State University sent out a call for proposals for honors seminar classes. I decided I was going to submit one. I did not submit a class about library skills or anything related to the library. That's just not my bliss. I couldn't see doing a full-length semester class on that. I know a lot of you can and have done it, and I applaud you. It just wasn't for me. Part of preparing was deciding what my subject would be. And I decided that I was going to focus on comics. I'm a big comics, graphic novel fan, really any sequential art. And my comics history research had been really focused on the civil rights era. So I decided that I wanted to do a class on autobiographical and biographical comics, building toward the end of the semester when the students would be creating their own comics about their own lives and their own experiences. So that was the first thing that I needed to do, and I wrote up a description of the class, and then I wrote up a mock syllabus. But I really didn't have any experience creating a syllabus, and so it looked a little more like it was just dates with like what we might read that week. Little did I know that was going to look a lot different by the end. Like I said, I chose comics as my class subject. It's something I'm very passionate about. It's something I'm very interested in. And I've been running grown-up comic book clubs in the Atlanta area for about 15 years. So I'd had experience leading discussion. I'd had experience talking about the specifics of comics and why and how comics work. And so as I started to think about a semester-long class, I realized I was going to have to break up my expectations for the class into parts. So the first unit was about how comics function and a little bit of the history of comics. The second unit was biography, so it was looking at comics that were written about people, about real people and their lives. The third section was autobiography, and we went heavily into examining and reading the graphic novel March, Volume 1. And I had them do library exercises with in particularly using March. And I'll get to that in a little bit. And then the last unit was, of course, creating their own materials. So that is how I saw the class, and that's how I proceeded. I used a lot of my librarian skills to get started and to figure out how to make this class into something that would be really, to me, very special, and hopefully to the students. So I had, of course, experience with gathering materials or kind of curating reading lists and designing assignments and chunking lectures, which I had done on a smaller scale in my database classes, my research classes. And I also knew that it would be important to bring in one of my colleagues as a librarian who could support the class, create a LibGuide for the class, and also be another point of contact if there was help needed during some of the more library skills heavy assignments. And also I've had, I think like a lot of you, a lot of experience formatting information. So what's easy to read? How does it look on the page or on the screen? How can I break it up into sections on the screen so that it's effective? All of those things that we do on a regular basis. The uncharted professorial territory included the syllabus. Now I already talked about the practice syllabus I created, which was fine and a good starting point. I used some examples that the Honors College gave me, as well as some of the professors I had worked with gave me some of their syllabi to look at, so I knew how to model it. I had to decide when the assignments were going to be due, so I eventually decided that we would have a unit on a particular concept or particular excerpts on biography or autobiography, and then the assignment that pertained to that lesson would be due the next week. I also learned that you have to include a lot of things about academic integrity, a lot of things that are kind of statements about the university, codes of conduct, and various other things. I was familiar with iCollege, which is our virtual learning platform, but I had never created a course in iCollege. So the Honors College signed me up for the Mastering Online Teaching program the summer before, and I learned an awful lot about how to break up pages and how to effectively communicate assignments and deadlines within that system. I had to learn how to grade. I set up a simple point system, so if it was turned in, they got the full points. I looked at this first semester experience as kind of teaching with training wheels, and I tried to take full advantage of that perspective. So instead of giving them a grade on the quality or what I perceived as the quality of their work, because in a lot of cases this was personal work, or it was by the end of the semester about their lives, I decided that, just turning something in would get them the points. And then, of course, lesson plans. What was I going to cover each week? I decided to teach from slides, so because we were virtual, so they could just see them on their screen and they could interact in that way. I also built into the lesson plan each class session we would have time for discussion, and we would discuss more about how comics worked. We would discuss other things that they liked reading. We would discuss pop culture that touched on similar ideas of what we had been talking about in class that week. So this was my class, the Honors 1000 Seminar Graphic Autobiography. And I learned a lot during this semester. I learned that you have to use just as many skills that I would have attributed to librarians, such as being quick on your feet, being able to pivot topics, knowing where resources are, and knowing how to effectively communicate them to your students. Those were all things that I already knew and already did as a librarian, but just did them in this new context. And then also as a professor, I found that I knew more about my subject than I imagined. I also felt incredibly heartened by how connected most of the students were to the materials. So in the biography section and autobiography section, each week I would include excerpts from various comics and graphic novels. And also I would include, if it was available, video of the cartoonist. So for example, we have here a drawing by Alison Bechdel, who's well known for Fun Home. And when we looked at sections from Fun Home, I also included videos of her talking about using references for drawings, as well as her perspective of growing up during the time period when Fun Home is set and how that informs her work. So I worked really hard to give a bigger context to these comics that the students could see and dive into. I feel like that's where professorial skills really kicked in, with providing more and more specialized information, and my librarian skills allowed me to access those pretty easily. The other thing I want to talk about is bringing in one of my library colleagues for the class. It was a really great thing to do, not only because I got to work with my library colleague on the other side. So I was the professor in this scenario, and that was a really valuable experience, being on the other side of those exchanges and explaining what the class was about and what the class needed, and then seeing it come to life through the LibGuide and then the presentation that my colleague made for the class. It also gave, as I said before, my students another point of reference or another point of contact. if they needed explanations or needed more help with accessing library resources. Because when we focused on March, Volume 1, I had them do assignments such as going in and finding primary source newspaper articles, primary source photographs. I really wanted the history of the book to come alive, and using my librarian know-how, I was able to take them deeper into that process than I would have normally. And having my colleague who was at the ready to answer their questions helped a great deal with that. There were a few funny miscommunications. One of the assignments was to look up a primary source news article on John Lewis, the late great John Lewis, which is his autobiography. Two of my students found information on a different John Lewis, who was a local politician in, I believe, North Carolina, who was known for his different styles of sitting. He was known for his different styles of sitting and communicating how he was going to vote by how he would sit. And that was a big wake-up call to maybe I need to clarify some of my assignments. So I'd done all this preparation and all this planning, and I was so nervous before my first class. But it turns out that the students were just so excited to be there. And they were so up for all the stuff that we did. And so I had a really, really great experience. This presentation is pretty simple in its concepts, and it's not really breaking new ground, but I wanted to remind all of you who may be thinking about teaching, maybe dipping your toe in a little bit, that we have all these amazing skills that we use every single day, and they are extremely useful in a classroom setting. And it's not something to be nervous about. It's actually can be an amazing adventure. I also want to encourage you that if you are going to teach, that it may not be on library skills. It's fine if it is, but expand your horizon a little bit and think past just the library. Because there are ways of incorporating library skills and research basics and databases into a regular class that's not about just that. And I think that you might get a further reach. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you have a great Glitter conference. If you have any questions or comments, you can contact me at this URL. It's a Google form that lets you tell me what you're thinking and or what questions you have. It shouldn't take me long to get back in touch with you. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great conference. Bye.